So in retrospect, it's clear to me that my phone was monitored, and they knew that I was talking to other donors about this high-level corruption, and they wanted me out of the country. And the way they made that happen was to grab my wife, take her out of town, tie her up, put her in an irrigation ditch. And then a young boy came by with a cow, and she could see him through the weeds. She hollered at him, and he came over and untied her feet. She walks toward town and finds some strawberry pickers with a cell phone. And she calls me and she said, I had an accident. And I said, well, so where are you? That's a long story, but that night my tour ended in Kyrgyzstan. I ended up, she got loose. 8 embassy security people picked her up, and then she called me back and she said, get out of the house. They know where we live.
Welcome to the Where Have You Been podcast. I'm your host, Bill Ream, and each week on the pod, I have conversations with incredible guests from all walks of life. Expect to hear funny, crazy, emotional, life-changing, and even sometimes life-threatening stories and experiences that will entertain and inspire you. As always, I appreciate your likes, subscriptions, ratings, and reviews wherever you are listening. It doesn't sound like much, but it truly helps the pod get to the ears of more people who may enjoy it. And check out the website, whybpodcast.com, for links to the socials where you can find pictures from the guests and their stories, and also buy merch if you're so inclined. Now let's get to this week's episode. Thank you for being here. Welcome into another episode of the Where Have You Been podcast. I am your host, as always, Bill Ream, and welcome in once again, another fantastic guest. And I say this every time, but I'm really looking forward to this one. We're going to get some unique perspective, I think, on travel. We have Cliff on the show today, a former USAID mission director. And I'm going to actually let you kind of introduce yourself since you know yourself better than I do or anyone else does. Cliff, welcome to the show. And if you wouldn't mind letting our listeners know, who are you?
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm happy to be here. Tomorrow I turn 77, and I live in the East Coast. I was commercial law in LA for about 15 years. But in terms of my travel experiences started when I dropped out of college between my sophomore and junior years, and I ended up working on a oceanographic ship that took me down to the South Pacific and then back up, stopping in various ports in Latin America. And that kind of put the bug in me to go overseas. And then after college, I had a fellowship where I was able to spend a year traveling around Latin America, which kind of reinforced that bug. And then I was a partner in a firm in LA, and a big case ended. That case has consumed me for about 3 years. It was a big bankruptcy case, and when it ended, I had my feet on the desk, and I had very little going on. So I was reading the newspaper, and I saw now they said that AID, and I didn't even know what that was at the time. It was the Agency for International Development. It's kind of a cheap pun that means foreign aid, but that's not what the letters stand for. And I flew back to DC. I interviewed with them, and I saw a big map on the wall. And they had little red pins all over the world. And I asked the guy what that was. He said, that's one of our trees. And something in me said, I got to have that job. So I spent almost the next 3 decades traveling around the world. I started in D.C., but I was covering countries in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic. And then because I spoke Spanish, they moved me to Nairobi, right? Which made a lot of sense. But I was traveling around Africa for 3.5 years. And then I got back to Latin America. I lived in Honduras for a couple of years, 5 years in Guatemala, 2.5 in Nicaragua, 2 years in Bogota, Colombia. And by then, my 2 kids that had followed me around had graduated from high school. They were in college, and my wife at the time decided that she was going to go back to LA and be a writer. And that's where she went. And we got divorced. And from Colombia, I went to Kyrgyzstan. I got remarried there. And then I had 3 more kids with my second wife. So from Kyrgyzstan, we went to Africa. And that in 2009, our young boy lost his medical clearance, so I retired. And I came to the Eastern Washington where I left, and I practiced law there for a while, but I didn't like it. And then I got a a chance to go back overseas with the same agency in 2013. So I went to Peru as a contractor, not as a diplomat. Before that, I had been a U.S. diplomat with the agency. In Peru, I was a contractor, and my wife came and gave birth to two girls who were raised in Maryland now, along with their older brother. So I've got 5 kids, 2 grandkids, and I had 2 marriages. That's where I am now. I'm retired. I was in Peru for 3.5 years. I came back to the DC area. Unlike the first time I retired, I went to the West Coast. This time I came to the East Coast just because I had more contacts out here, and my wife wanted to be near some of her Kyrgyz girlfriends. She's from Kyrgyzstan originally, and so here I am. I'm retired in Maryland now, but I wrote a book last year because I was so mad about the what they did to the agency, but we can get into that later on. That's what I'm doing now.
And I was going to say, I failed to mention, it's so funny because I feel like about 2/3 of my guests have written at least one book, which is, it's pretty amazing to have so many authors on the show. And I don't know why it slipped my mind to mention that you are also an author. So, I mean, why not? If you don't mind, maybe in a nutshell, like kind of what is the book about? I know you just said it's about like kind of what they did to the agency, but maybe not with getting into too much detail, but I'd like to hear a little more about that.
Well, actually, it's the second part of a longer story. I already published the book about 6 years ago called Dilettante, and it was basically a collection of my tales about growing up in Eastern Washington and working in that ship, that oceanographic ship, and then my fellowship year down in Latin America. It tells the stories of where I went from here. I wrote it for the sake of my kids or grandkids. I wanted there to be some sort of record of what had gone down. And then, but I didn't finish the story. It stopped in 1989 and got me to Nairobi. So last year I got inspired to finish the story, and at the same time add a little context to what the agency was about. So most of it was written over the last 30 years, but there are some chapters that just got produced last year. But it's about the AID, and it's about my own career meeting around business that fell apart really quickly and unexpectedly. So I had basically 2 or 3 messages I was trying to convey. First of all, we weren't a bunch of crooks. If anything, we were the exact opposite. Secondly, foreign aid did a lot of good. The social consensus, and I apologize if your focus is normally not on politics, but I lived in some places where society fell apart rather quickly and unexpectedly. And I also had the privilege of living in the former Soviet Union after it fell apart. I don't know if you recall, but when that happened, we may have applauded it, but it was a pretty surprising event. And what's going down now kind of scares me in this country. So that's what the book's about. AID and my own attitude about the social consensus and about foreign aid and my own stories. Some of them are funny, some of them are tragic. At one point, my wife got kidnapped. I tell that story. That's what the book's about. The second one.
Incredible. And I'm sure, and there's probably no way you could include like all of your stories in there, of course, but I imagine that what's in there is probably really, really eye-opening and entertaining at the same time. Where can people find you? I like to kind of do this early just to make sure that as people listen, if they don't get all the way to the end, they have an easy reference point to go back and see where they can find you. I know you have some socials. Do you have a website?
I do, and I'm glad you asked because there's a Clifford Brown that's way more famous than me, but he died in the 50s. He was a black trumpet player, jazz trumpet player, one of the best ones. When I was in college, I was a DJ, and I used to say, this is Clifford Brown bringing you the side. This is Clifford Brown, and I used to get shot, from the prisoners in the Wall State Penitentiary, which we burned outside the city where I went to college. So I have a website, but it's Clifford H. Brown. The H stands for Harris. It's cliffordhbrown.com. And you can find the pictures of both books there and some links to I write on a Substack called cliffordbrown.substack.com. There is no H in that one, but that's where people can find what I've written. I've been writing about a lot of different subjects, character reporting.
Awesome. And you do have other socials too, Facebook and
Right. Those links are there to LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. I've got a Twitter account.
yeah. And I was going to say, I'm sure you can get them from the website. I'll also post them in the description of the episode as well. So if anyone's interested in finding you and finding out more about you, or maybe just they want to ask you a question or something about something, that would be the way to go about it. Before we get into kind of like the bulk of what the show is, I always like to take a moment and ask, and I know that you sort of referenced it already, but I'm not sure if there's more before that. When did travel become a thing in your life? Did you travel as a child with your family, or was it once you started getting into the workforce and kind of work took you into these travels?
The only international trip I took when I was a kid is my dad is from Texas, and we took a family trip when I was 13, and he went down into Mexico for part of it. So I ended up running around the streets of Monterrey, Mexico, thinking we could speak enough Spanish to communicate with the other kids in the streets. And that was the only other experience I had overseas until I worked on that ship. I got a job as a dishwasher on a U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey ship out of Seattle. And then somebody asked me if I could type, and I said yes, but I really didn't know how. But I failed the state typing exam, and he said, "Well, we don't care. You can work in the office, but we're gonna have to pay you as a dishwasher." Well, 9 months later, I was a pretty good typer, but that boat into Tahiti and then over to Easter Island. We had to medevac somebody on Easter Island. Then it went to Valparaiso, Chile, and the officers came to the ship's office and said, "Clip, your cousin's at the gangway." And I was like, I have a cousin down here. And they said, "Well, he said he's your cousin. He looks like you." It kind of sounds like you. Sure enough, I had a cousin in the Peace Corps, and he met me there at the dock. And
How did he know you were there?
our mothers knew that my mom knew his mom, and she knew that he was. I mean, the moms knew that I was going to Valparaiso, Chile on this ship. And so his mother told him, "Go meet your cousin Cliff." And he did. And he got his fiancée with him. And so when I got there, I met him for the first time. Well, of course, cousins in Texas I'd never met. And he was waiting. So he introduced me to her father. And then 2 years later, when I got that fellowship, I ended up going down there and living with this retired Chilean doctor. By then, he had gotten married and moved to Minneapolis with his Chilean wife. But Dr. Echeverria was still down there, and I wrote him and I said, I'm here on the fellowship. And he said, "Come on down." So I lived with him and his housekeeper for about 9 months in 1973. And that's really where I picked up the Spanish. I mean, I'd studied it in school, but that didn't mean anything. When I got there, I really had to use it because he didn't speak a word of English. And by the end of that year, I was pretty fluent in it. So that was, that year I spent on the ship was the first real introduction to international travel. And then later, I had a whole year where I was supposed to go down there and that's a long story. I was supposed to, the proposal is I was going to work on farms in Latin America, but that was a stupid idea. And I got down to El Salvador, and I was out in the middle of a cotton plantation, like I was going to pick cotton alongside these people. About 300 local laborers stood up and looked at me. "Who's this crazy gringo? Why is he here?" And I realized it was a dumb idea. It was also illegal for me trying to work on a tourist visa. So I wrote the foundation and I said, you can have your money back. I don't want to do this. And they said, "No, this happens to a lot of our fellows, kid. You figure out something else to do." So that's when I wrote to my cousin's father-in-law and headed down to Chile for the balance of the year. But
Wow.
those were the two episodes that introduced me to international travel.
And that was like somewhere in the middle of all that, you sort of had, I don't, maybe you didn't have like an aha moment specifically, but you realized during that this was something that you wanted to do, whether it was through work or just personally, you wanted to see the world.
Well, it wasn't so much the world itself. It was the fact that I was able to talk to people in Spanish, and I really got very good at it. And when you start using another language, it's almost like you bring another soul. And I felt that to me was a mind bending experience. I just felt like I was another person. And then I always wanted to use my Spanish in my work, but I couldn't do that in the business world. Right? there is you to do it, if you're doing a different kind of law. But I was doing commercial Chapter 11 bankruptcies and securities offerings and whatnot. There's no way I was going to be using Spanish in that. So when this case ended, I had a chance to go with an agency that was going to send me overseas, and I told them the offer came to me was to work in the Latin America Bureau. They ended up sending me to Norway. Eventually, I got back and I was able to do what I wanted. And then they sent me back to school later. They sent me to school for 6 months. I got paid to learn French, and then they sent me again to learn Russian. So I took full advantage of it. I'm still a fan of foreign languages. It's just an experience that you don't know what it means until you're really using it, and then you feel like another person.
Do you still remember any French and Russian, or is it mostly Spanish?
But to put a lot of things, I completely can't in all three of them, but
Wow.
way better than Spanish. I appeared on television. I did a lot of media. We still do. I mean, I have language partners. There's a program called Tandem that will put you in touch with people in other countries that want to, learn English. So you can sit there and chit chat back and forth with them. I'm working on Mandarin Chinese right now. And every morning I talk to a lady in Dongguan, China, and I read, and I don't try to, well, I try, but it would take 10 years to learn their characters, but I can learn the pinyin, which is a Latinized version of their language. And she reads the English and I read the pinyin, and we correct each other. But yeah, my Russian is, it's not as good as my Spanish, but I can shout it. I negotiated deals with governments and did the same in Guinea and with French.
Wow. Yeah, I was just curious because I know it's one of those things that sometimes if you don't use it, you lose it. And I don't know how much you would still use Russian today, but I love languages. I only speak English, but I'm definitely going to start with Spanish one of these days, I swear. So,
It
but
takes a lot of work. That's the secret. You just have to use it, and you have to not be afraid to make a mistake. And that's the biggest obstacle is most adults, they're just too shy to actually use it and make a mistake. And that's one reason kids can learn it so much easier because they don't check. But you have to get to a point where you really force yourself to say something, even if you know you're making a mistake. That's why I love this tandem program because they expect you to make a mistake and get correct in the and get correct in the English. It's a win-win deal.
yeah, that sounds pretty awesome. I may have to check that out once I get to a point where I get some base of Spanish and then, have that to be able to practice with. So let's do this because I feel like you have so many experiences and stories to tell, and I'm sure a lot of them may be in your books, but maybe we'll touch on some that are not. But this is where I ask, and you've already mentioned a lot of places. You don't have to go over the whole list again, but I still have to ask, Cliff Brown, where have you been?
Well, I've been in Africa. I lived there for 5 years on both sides. I lived in Nairobi for 2 years and the West Africa for 2 years. When I was in Iran, I job with regionals. So basically, there's more places I did not go than, there's more places I went than I did not go to. I last count, there's been about 60 different countries, but I still really some wonderful times in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, because Uganda and Tanzania were right next door, and I had a family, and I had a time on the weekends. We got local holidays off, so we drove to Kampala, Uganda, for Christmas one day, or one year. We went down to Mombasa a lot to the Indian Ocean. I learned how to scuba dive down in the Indian Ocean in Mombasa. I got to Zanzibar quite often, and that's home of the Serengeti, nature park and game park. And we went to all the parks around Kenya and not all of them in Tanzania by any means, but I got out to Zanzibar, which is really a very exotic island off the coast of Zanzibar. And I into this mainly to the capital city, Dar es Salaam, but in Kenya we drove all over and in some of these places like Kampala, they're surprisingly beautiful places. The Brits had really good taste when they chose their colonies, far better taste than the French have, I'd have to say.
And you sort of answered one of my questions I was going to ask, which was obviously your job took you to all these different places, but then I was going to ask you, how much time did you have to travel just for leisure? And even outside of that, and maybe even since retirement, have you had a chance to do some travels, just for yourself, just for pleasure?
Well, I do. I have once a year. I try to get over to Switzerland, where my oldest daughter is living with my two grandsons. But I haven't tried to travel. I still do some work for a guy in Peru, so there've been a couple trips down to Peru and one trip to Guatemala since I stopped working. But I didn't. I mean, I traveled all over East Africa, and the travel in West Africa was basically job related, and it wasn't as extensive. I drove back and forth between Freetown and Guinea a lot. Freetown is the capital of Sierra Leone. Guinea, Conakry is up in Guinea, and they're only about 5 hours away by car. In Central Asia, we deliberately traveled a lot around there, and I got down to Uzbekistan and Bukhara and Samarkand and Kashgar and the Xinjiang region of China and went to Urumqi. China is amazing. They've got some cities there on the west side they're really huge cities that most Americans have never heard of. And Urumqi is one. You go in there and it feels like Seattle or something. It's way the hell on the other side of China. So yeah, we traveled around Central Asia quite a bit. And because my wife is a native Russian speaker, she took me up to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I didn't mention all the places. In Latin America, I've been to virtually every country down there except the Guyanas and Venezuela. So I spent a lot of time traveling. I mean, the first time I did it was on that ship, but when we got to port, I was able to go ashore and say in Buenaventura, Colombia. My version of a CD tour there was to get off the boat and just get on a bus and pay the fare and just sit there until the bus came back to the same place. And I would ride around on these buses, and I saw some of the most horrendous poverty in Buenaventura, Colombia. It was amazing. The, the black population there was enormous because slavery was a big deal down there too. And the descendants are living in, and this was in the 770, early 73, I guess. It was incredible how poor the place was. And then in Chile, it was very different. That was a much more developed country, but I did get into Santiago from the coast at one point on the train. And then when I had that fellowship, after I left Chile, I returned north by land. I hitchhiked over to Mendoza, Argentina, and then I took a bus into Buenos Aires, took a ferry of some sort over to Montevideo, Uruguay. And then I took buses up into Brazil. And I visited the parents of one of my college buddies they were living in Sao Paulo. But after that, I took trains and buses and worked my way, I guess, west to Cochabamba, Bolivia, then back up to La Paz, where I stayed. I was about 6 weeks up there not getting over a bad cold I had caught in Cochabamba. And then I took a bus down to Lima and then flew home, and that ended my fellowship here in Latin America. So I've seen Latin America from the buses and from the trains, and speak about all of the places. Quito, Ecuador is one of the most fascinating, beautiful cities I've ever seen. But
Oh, listen, yeah, I mean, and you're welcome to, because your list is so extensive, and again, and your history with travel goes back, 50 plus years, and the wealth of stories that you have, best what if you have favorite stories, favorite locations, favorite experiences, by all means, start there. It's my favorite thing when a guest has traveled so extensively that I can just kind of let you run, and then I can just interject with my own curiosity. So wherever you'd like to start us off, by all means.
I think Guatemala is probably the most story-worthy place I can talk about, because I was there 5 years and I bought a little Ford van with a queen bed in the back and 4 captain seats, and we drove all over Guatemala. Both my oldest kids graduated from high school there, but we had a lot of guests that would come to town. So if people in the States don't take advantage of, say, visiting Antigua, Guatemala, during Easter vacation. It's just amazing. It's one of these places, and it's not the only one on earth where they celebrate Easter by decorating the streets with carpets made of flowers. And they spend days bringing these flowers in, and they're the prettiest things. The whole city is, all the streets are these carpeted collections of flowers. And then that weekend, right after Good Friday, they march through the city, and then you walk over these same carpets, and they plunge, and of course they destroy them. But the crowds come from all over the world, and you have to make a hotel reservation 2 or 3 years in advance to be able to see this. And it's just phenomenal. They carry these gigantic floats, they call them, but imagine the kind of floats you might see in a Macy's parade, but they're not on wheels. They're people, there's hundreds of people under them, and they're carrying them. And they're marching down, and it depends on which day you're there, but they'll have bands playing funeral music and or different kinds of music depending on which aspect of the Easter holiday they're celebrating. And it's just a sight that's phenomenal. Antigua itself has some hotels they used to be monasteries or convents, and so they've been converted into, very upscale, modern Western kind of hotels, except they've preserved the interiors like they were still where the monks lived. So, and the nuns lived. When I was there, we had a lot of official visitors. Bill Clinton came a couple of times, Madeleine Albright came once, Hillary Clinton came once, Al Gore came, and they always wanted to go to Antigua. And of course, the Guatemalans accommodated that because it's so historic and it's so beautiful. The city is surrounded by these perfectly shaped volcanic cones, and it's got like springtime weather all year round. It's about 6,000 feet altitude. And then if you've got time and you can travel further up to the north to Lake Atitlán, there's a lake up there that is in the cauldron of an ancient volcano. And around the rim of that lake, they have other volcanoes, smaller cones. It's like kind of like Crater Lake in Oregon. But there again, it's so perfectly green, and it's this idyllic temperature. It's one of the prettiest sights in the world, and it just doesn't get enough publicity in the U.S. I think it's close. It's an amazing sight. And then we used to drive down to Livingston on the Caribbean coast, and that's a town that's completely, well, I don't know, maybe in those days it was utterly isolated in terms of fluid on a boat. So you could go down the river from, they call it Lago Isolado, with the Lake Isabel, which are named after Queen Isabel. And on that lake, there's a town called El Estor, E-S-T-O-R. And the reason they call it El Estor is because the British used to have some tin mines and around that lake, and the only store around was down there where the town is. So they called the town was called El Estor. And that's where the British miners used to go to buy their tools and whatnot. But then you can take these boats that go down the Livingston River, and that's where they filmed the Tarzan movies. And it's this windy river that goes down through these really big green hills on both sides that are populated by the most vivid, white birds that are looking down they're divers that will go after fish in the river. And every now and then the boat will pull over to the side, and you could get into a hot spring that's probably into the river. And you could sort of take a jacuzzi there. Just, you're in the river, but the part you're in is on top of a hot spring. And then you get to Livingston, and it's something out of another world. It's this all black town. It's descendants of slaves that were brought many years ago, with some Guatemalans, and you see some Mayan-looking people there too. But and you also see a lot of pleasure craft and what I infer it might be, running yachts, things like that. But there's a series come there, and it's just a fascinating place. It's just south of Belize. If you go further up the coast from Livingston, you're in Belize, which has a more British background. But then return to Lake Isabel, and they have a little fire in the northern shore of it called the Finca Paraíso, the Paradise Farm, and you get on a tractor, or we would get on a trailer towed by a tractor, and he would haul us into the interior. You come to a lake that's fed by hot streams, and they even have a volcano there that's a hot volcano. So you get up underneath it, and it's like you're underneath a flowing jacuzzi then. And then underneath the volcano, the waterfall, there's a cave in there. You swim around in this warm water, and it's just out of this world, the sights you see in Central America.
Yeah, I have spent very little time in Central America, but what I have spent in Central and even South America, or maybe were you South America or Central? That was Central America.
Yeah, I was thinking more about Guatemala, but also I didn't talk about Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and it's all really fun from a tourist standpoint.
Yeah. So I spent some time in Costa Rica. I've been there a handful of times, one of my favorite places in the world also. And I've only been to a couple of places in Peru and a couple of places in Colombia, but I loved every minute of it. So I can absolutely see, you know, I haven't seen the different things, the volcanoes, the rivers and the things that you're talking about, but the beauty that I experienced, absolutely. It's on my list to go back.
Yeah, one of the first time I traveled by bus from Medellin down to Quito, you're riding on the Pan American Highway, and it's like you're on mountains that are as steep as anything in the world, and yet they are covered with palm trees on both sides. So you're the sometimes you're up at the crest of these mountain ridges, and you're looking down thousands of feet, gazing over the tops of palm trees down into these lush green valleys, but it's lush even on top of those mountains. And it's just a fantastic trip to see it. And I think most Americans are concerned about safety and whatnot, and rightly so, because of the occasional traffic accidents that they have up there, but it's still quite a sight.
Yeah, I can only imagine that. And when you were in Medellin, I'm sure it was a different time. When was that? Also in the 70s?
Well, the first time, yeah, it was in late 72 when I was trying to, pursue that fellowship in El Salvador, and I gave up on it, and I ended up going down to Chile. So I left El Salvador, and I traveled by bus down to Panama. I flew from there to Medellin, and then I continued on buses all the way to Lima. And then I got to La Paz. Somehow I remember that I was kicking myself years later because I did not go to Machu Picchu, but I took the buses up from Lima over to Puno and then to La Paz. And finally in La Paz, I caved in and bought an airline ticket to go to Santiago so I could finally get to my cousin's father-in-law down on the coast of Chile. But I saw everything from Medellin down to La Paz from a bus or a train or sometimes in a car. But
Now, was that pre like all of the drug activity and stuff in Medellin, or was that kind of while everything was going on? I was fortunate to go enough to go, I guess, after everything was sort of cleaned up and now it's all very different. But interested to know what it was like.
this was before the major drug gangs that
Okay.
took in control of Medellin, although at the time I avoided Bogota deliberately because every traveler I met, and young people on the road, then there was sort of a community of travelers, and you kind of bump into these people at the hostels, and then you might bump into 300 miles later, you meet the same people. Depends on which direction they were going. But everybody I met that had gone through Bogota had a story to tell about street crime. So I didn't go there in the 70s. I got assigned there later in 2000 to go live there. And I had a completely different impression when I got there, almost 28 years later. It was one of the most civilized places I'd ever lived in. Even to this day, I say that. But in the early 70s, Bogota was a place to avoid. So I deliberately went to Medellin and then just immediately caught a bus on down to Quito. Um, but no, the drugs that was a later development.
I see. Yeah, and again, even in Bogota, I was there 3 years ago, something like that, and I had a wonderful time there. I thought it was really great. So,
I like to say the Colombians are like the English of Latin America. They are so polite, and they would address me sometimes, and they would say in Spanish, they'd say, "Your mercy, su merced," and I wouldn't know who they were talking about until it took me, the first time it happened, what are you saying? And they said, "Your mercy." So instead of saying "Señor," or, they would call me "Your mercy." It was
wow.
bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're looking around like, is there somebody that's here beside me? But you mentioned, and I don't mean to take away from where we are in the world, but you mentioned something that I don't want to forget to talk about. At the very beginning, you talked about somebody was, did you say, what wasn't, was it kidnapped or something to that effect somewhere in the world?
Yeah. Well, in Kyrgyzstan, I was the country representative of our foreign aid program. And I have to preface this by saying that when the former Soviet Union broke up, the infrastructure had never been designed with national borders in mind. So Kyrgyzstan is a very mountainous country, and it has a lot of hydroelectric power plants, and it was basically the hydro generation, not all of it, but it was a major source of hydroelectricity for Russia and Kazakhstan. And people in the Kyrgyz government figured out that, they could make a lot of money selling electricity to the north that was unmetered, and they could get paid under the table, and it was high level corruption. And while we were suffering blackouts in Kyrgyzstan, the electricity was going north into Kazakhstan and Russia, and I knew the details. And I won't get into why I knew them, but we worked in the energy sector, and I had some people on my staff that were feeding me these details. So I was very outspoken about high level corruption in Kyrgyzstan. And I said what I knew to some of the other donors, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. I also got interviewed on a television program there at one point, and I revealed the fact that I had married a Kyrgyz woman. And that's about a week before the Marine Ball. Every embassy in the world has how they call it, the birthday party for the Marines, and it's on Veterans Day. And so they put on a big dance, and it's a dinner and dance. And it's, for me, in my position, it was sort of a command performance. I was expected to attend. And my wife was out getting ready to go to the Marine Ball. And of course, she was looking forward to it, wanted to get her new shoes and a hairdo and whatnot. She came out of a hairdresser in downtown Bishkek, and three guys with guns jumped in the car behind her and grabbed her, pulled her into the back seat, and drove her out of town. And on the way out of town, after she got done kicking and screaming, they said, "Older sister, we're not going to hurt you, but your husband owes our boss money." And that was not true. Nobody had asked me for money. I didn't do any business there. I was just a diplomat doing my job. But I had obviously been overheard by some of the intelligence people that worked for that government. A lot of the former KGB people, when they became part of another country, they had nothing better to do than to spy on donors. So in retrospect, it's clear to me that my phone was monitored, and they knew that I was talking to other donors about this high-level corruption, and they wanted me out of the country. And the way they made that happen was to grab my wife, take her out of town, tie her up, put her in an irrigation ditch. And then a young boy came by with a cow, and she could see him through the weeds. She hollered at him, and he came over and untied her feet. She walks toward town and finds some strawberry pickers with a cell phone. And she calls me, and she said, "I had an accident." And I said, "Well, so where are you?" That's a long story, but that night my tour ended in Kyrgyzstan. She got loose. 8 embassy security people picked her up, and then she called me back and she said, "Get out of the house. They know where we live." And I had no clue what she was talking about. And the security guys called me and said, "We got her. We're taking her to the police station." I said, "Should I come?" And they said, "No, you stay out of it." And then they called me back about half an hour later and said, "Yep, it does involve you. You better come down here." So we spent the whole night in police stations. And then they took us in an armored car and took us to Almaty, which at the time was the capital city Well, it was the main commercial city where the U.S. Embassy was located in Kazakhstan, even though the government capital is up in another city called Astana, a place I've never been to. But Almaty is a big town, and it's in the south part of Kazakhstan. So they took us there, and we had to hang out for about 6 weeks while the FBI came to town. And it's a long story. I tell it in one of the chapters in my book. And then they wanted us to come back to Bishkek to identify some people they had arrested. And we ended up staying with Masha Yovanovich. She's the same ambassador that got booted out of her. She got fired by Trump. She was the ambassador to Ukraine. And at the time, she was our ambassador in Kyrgyzstan. So we stayed with her and her mom at the ambassador's residence for a few days while my wife went down to the police station to see if she could identify these guys. And she didn't know them. She said, no, I don't know who they are. And then we left. And 15 months later, our stuff came to Guinea in West Africa. We didn't even pack it out. The embassy had to pack us out. So that's one of the stories in the book.
That's absolutely incredible. And this all took place over the hours of that one night?
Well, the kidnapping took place the night of November 11th, 2006 is when she got kidnapped. Now, there's the lead up to that is the period in which I was speaking out about high level corruption, and it's also the time in which I was interviewed on the national television. So they knew that there was a connection between me and a local citizen. And when some of the follow up to that, it's a long story. I don't know that we could tell the whole thing here, but I left my car there. They took my car and they drove it down to Osh, which is another city in the south. And then they parked it right behind the aid annex. We had a satellite office down in Osh, and they parked my car down there. And the guy working for me called me. He says, "Cliff, you won't believe it, but your car is behind the USAID building. USAID sent U.S. Agency for International Development." He said, "Your car is parked right here." And so then the FBI wanted to stake it out, and they wanted clothing, and they tried to, match DNA to some of her clothing that she was wearing the night it happened. So, and even a year later, these guys were still in jail, and they were going to have a trial. We went back to show the baby to some of her relatives, and they wanted us to attend the trial as if we had anything to say useful at that point. But as I say, it's a long story to tell you the whole thing, but it was traumatic, and I'm wiser because of it. I don't think I would be nearly so outspoken if I were, or I'd be more discreet about who I was telling things to and where I did it.
Yeah. But I guess just my own curiosity again, I don't want to belabor this or anything, but from the time that they took her until she called you to say that she had an accident, was that a matter of hours or was that a day? Like,
It was all in an afternoon. She had left around, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and we needed to be at the ball, I think, around 6 or 7, and she was late getting home, and I wondered, where is she? What's taking so long? And that's when I get this phone call.
oh my God.
So that night, we didn't get to go to the ball. In fact, we didn't sleep at all. We went to one police station, and they wanted us to tell our entire life story as they typed it out. I had to tell them where I went to high school. It was just nuts, the details they were asking us. And after we'd been doing that for a couple of hours, they said, "You know what? That hairdresser she came out of, that's on the other side of Sovietskaya Boulevard. You're in the wrong police station. You got to go to a different police station and tell this whole story over again." So around sunrise, they finally let us loose, and that's when they said, "Okay, you're out of here. We're sending the car, grab a suitcase or two, and stuff them with what you're going to need for a few weeks up in Almaty." So that's what we were allowed to go back to the place just to pack a suitcase, and then they took us up to Almaty the next day.
Wow. That's absolutely amazing. We've never had a tale like that on the podcast before. So thank you for that. I'm sorry that it happened. But yeah, amazing. How about if and I'm sorry to do that. I don't necessarily mean to just kind of jump around, but maybe is there something lighter we can, if we shift gears and go lighter to anywhere else in the world that you've been, that just maybe some fun experiences that you've had?
Well, if you've been to Peru, you probably went up to Machu Picchu. I got to tell you, the first time I went there it was after law school. I had been went by it a couple of times. Twice I went by it on that fellowship. I went by it on my way up to La Paz, and went by it on my way down to Lima from La Paz, but I didn't go to Cusco or Machu Picchu. So after law school, I think I decided we took the law exam, but the results had been come out for quite a while. So I convinced him that if he if you travel with me, you buy a round trip ticket to go to Buenos Aires with unlimited stopovers. You were stopped in Lima and Lubar. And I had enough experience in that part of Peru, in Quito in particular, which was a city, I swear to God, they make their living by ripping off tourists. That's how they do. That's how they survive. Because most people that go there, they never even come back, and they're not really worried about goodwill. So they'll think you're crazy. And I told my friend, I said, if we're going to go to Pino on the way there, we're going to see Cusco, Machu Picchu, and then take a land route over to La Paz, and we'll stop at Lake Titicaca and also see Quino. We want to have a prepaid tour, so we bought a Diners Club tour. Everything was prepaid, and when we went to the airport one morning to catch our plane up to Cusco, and the taxi driver told us it'd be 10 soles to take us to the airport. So when we get to the airport, we're not even at the terminal. We're about 400 yards away at the terminal, and the purpose right up to it. He wanted another 10 soles. And just on the principle, we said, I wish you get us to the airport. We're not going to pay you twice the agreed price. So I got out of the taxi and I left a little satchel inside the cab. And normally that satchel had all my money and my passport and our tickets. But that morning, for some reason, I had put the tickets and my money and my passport and it got inside my vest pocket. So I still had those with me, but he drove off. And then I realized he's got my glasses and he's got a $400 Pentax camera. And that was his Christmas present for the year, I think. But so I got to Machu Picchu with my friend, and I couldn't see anything because he had my glasses that were down there, still in Lima. And I eventually got another pair when we finally got to Chile with my friend. So 30 years later, he came back to visit me when I was back in Peru, I recall, as a contractor with USAID. And we went up and we saw Machu Picchu properly, did you go there when you were traveling in Peru?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. I mean, then it's just out of this world. It's mind-boggling. And I had taken an Irish feed up there, and I learned to play a song on it, which was the song of the condor. It's da 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 da. I could play that on my flute, and I was up there inside. I thought, well, it would be appropriate to play the flight of the condor inside one of these buildings that they've got up there, the old, the ruins of the city they had. So I was in there playing that thing, and it was echoing all around Machu Picchu. And, a lot of people liked it, but the guards, and they were dressed in white. I think they looked like Japanese guards, but they were Peruvian, I guess. But they were running around like crazy trying to figure out, where is that noise coming from? It was coming from me, and I didn't know it was bothering anybody, but I stepped outside and I looked down a long hill, and there was a guy there. He finally saw me, and he's wagging his finger at me, telling me I knew what he was saying. That's prohibido. You can't play music, which I thought was a pity, because I thought it deserved some music. But it's the sight you see up there. It's just looking down on the Urubamba River, way down in the distance, just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's one of the places on earth that you see photos of a place and you think, well, can it really be that beautiful? I think it's more awe-inspiring when you actually see it in person.
I'm saying,
It was my wife's at the time. It was her idea to go. And to me, I just never had really given it much of a thought. Like, okay, I know it's beautiful and incredible, and how they built that up so high, and it's mind blowing how it even exists. But yeah, it just never was a thing. But I'm so glad that I did it.
Now, it's got to be on everybody's bucket list. The only place I've ever seen that comes close to it in terms of the difference between photographs and the reality is the Taj Mahal in India. When I lived in Kenya, I had to go to New Delhi for a training event for a week. And they were sending one lady with me, and she had worked in India before. So we deliberately went a couple days earlier, and we got a cab, one of those old, I don't know what, they look like Studebakers, but they're not called Studebakers. But in those days, they were all the cabs in India that seemed to be those student cars. And we drove to Agra, which is a city a couple hours south of New Delhi. And when I saw the Taj Mahal in person, I mean, it was goosebumps forever. We stood there just soaking it up. It's just one of the most fabulous sights I've ever been exposed to. And the difference between being there and seeing a picture of it is just night and day. There's just no comparison.
So, and I've never been to the Taj Mahal, but so what would you recommend if I do take a trip and I go there? How long do I need to spend there to really experience it?
Well, at least a day, a full day in Agra. We at one point, we were there for several hours, and you can walk around the grounds and you can soak it up. And then there are other things to see in the city, the Red Fort and some other places, one of the large forts that's still, where the Brits fought and the Indian, the Maharaja or whoever it was that built it. If you get into that part of the world, I would think it would be a pity not to also stop in Uzbekistan and see some of the guy that built the Taj Mahal was the grandson of Babur, who came from Oth, that city I mentioned in the south of Kyrgyzstan. His grandson went down into India and founded that he was the one that built the Taj as a tomb for his young bride who died early in their marriage. But his grandfather came from Osh, and Osh and also Samarkand and Bukhara are really historic, exotic places that are just not on most tourists' itinerary. And I think they need to be. If they're going to get all the way to India and to the Taj Mahal, then try to see some of the other cities that share some of the same history, because they're just phenomenal. In Samarkand, you'll see the tomb of Tamerlane, who was one of the early conquerors, a major part of the Middle East. You got all the way to the historic part of Palestine at one point, and even Alexander the Great got to Uzbekistan, and it's just some phenomenal tourist sites you can see there. And the infrastructure is really very, very good. It's good, or perhaps even better than what you saw in Peru.
And I think part of the problem for many of us as Americans is, and we kind of touched on this on other episodes before, that we work so that we can travel, or we travel when we can because we have to make the money. And here in the States, if you get 2 weeks of vacation a year, depending on what your job is, maybe if you're lucky, you get 3. But it's tough to take them all at once. And so that's the hard part. Is I feel like some of these places you really need to go and spend weeks, not just a 6 or 7 day trip, because you really can't take it all in.
Well, that's true. It does take time, unless you go with a guided tour of some sort. That's how I saw China. I've been here twice, once on a guided tour, and then once I tried it down myself. That was a sort of a goat rope when I went without a translator and whatnot. But yeah, you can find these tours, if you can afford them, these tours that will take you sort of 2 or 3 day pit stops in each of these cities, and then you can get it done in a couple of weeks, but you pay for it.
Yeah, yeah. And as long as it doesn't, the ones that I don't like are the ones that try to cram as much as possible into a short amount of time, where you see a couple of places every day, but you really don't get to experience and enjoy them. So yeah, I think the right ones, like you said, if you can maybe do a couple weeks where you can actually spend a couple of days in each place instead of just a few hours, that would be the
Yeah,
way to go.
what I don't like about some of these organized tours, they're more interested in seeing how much money you can spend on souvenirs in different places, and they're deliberately taking you to, say, a silk shop or a tea shop or you name it, so that they can earn their commission by bringing the guests there. That's one thing I would be very wary of. But if you could find one that doesn't do that, then I think it would be 2 or 3 days. is plenty in most of these cities, at least to get a flavor for what's so exotic about it.
Sure. Well, where are some other of your favorite places that you've been in the world?
Well, Colombia, if you get outside of Bogota, has some really phenomenal places. I like to go down to the coffee region, which is a lower altitude. It's up in the upper reaches of the Magdalena River. And there's some towns there, Pereira. Well, Cali is not in the coffee region, but Pereira and Armenia, that are two that I can remember. In one of those towns, and I don't know which one, the Willis Jeep company shipped that entire factory of production machines that they used to make World War II Jeeps. So they're still running that factory and they're cranking out these Jeeps, but they're painting them phenomenal colors, red and orange and pink and yellow. And they are small enough that they can get up into the hills, and they use them as pickups. So they get these old, they look like World War II Jeeps because they're made by the same factory that was producing them. I don't know where it came from, but they're still cranking them out. And I remember going to the town plaza in either Pereira or Armenia, and they're not big cities. They're maybe 40,000, 50,000 people, but they're very picturesque, and the whole plaza was surrounded by these multicolored Jeeps that were being used by the coffee farmers. And they have some wonderful resorts up in those areas too. Medellin is also. Did you get that when you were in Colombia?
Yes, yes, yeah. Just like I say, it was just a few years ago. It was absolutely, and I've mentioned that I've mentioned this a few times, and then people are probably sick of hearing me say it, but maybe one of the most impactful places I've ever been. Just as far as I was just blown away by the culture and the people and the murals and just the beauty there. There's many places in the world that I want to get to see, and so I hesitate to want to go back to places I've already been, but that is on my list to go back.
Yeah. And on mine too, for the same reason. Botero, it's just a phenomenal city, and it's beauty, but it's not the only one in Colombia. You will find that same culture. As I said, they are the English of Latin America, and they're incredibly welcoming people, and they're very polite, and their infrastructure, it was phenomenal, not just in that city, but in places like Barranca Bermeja, in Bucaramanga, in Cartagena, in many of the cities the big cities or the middle-sized cities in Colombia, and there are many of them. And that's people in the States just don't talk. We know about Bogota, we know about Medellin, if we've done the Cartagena, we know about that, but there's so many other cities that are sizable. It's like saying you've been to America when you only know New York and San Francisco or DC. We have phenomenal cities that many tourists, when they come to the States, they don't even think about visiting. I was just in Charleston just 3 days ago. I'd never been there. It's amazingly beautiful. I want to go back when the flowers are blooming, but you know, Colombia is the same way. They've got all kinds of cities, just like we do, that tourists don't go to, except the local. The local tourists know them. They're great places to visit.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about this too, that I think we overlook a lot of the places in our own country that have their own beauty and uniqueness, and every region is so different than another. It's there's definitely a lot more to explore here, and my first thought is it's one of those things. If it's in your backyard, or maybe I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so like Wyoming or Washington State, they're not my backyard per se. But I always think, okay, well, I can get to these other states anytime I want to. But when I have a good deal to go overseas somewhere, I'm going. And I probably do it a disservice to our own country by thinking that way. But I think a lot of us do think that way.
No, that's true. There's plenty to see here. I grew up in Eastern Washington. At the time, I didn't know a thing about the geology of it, but it's one of the most fascinating places on Earth from a geologist standpoint. And going back there in a few weeks to show my girls where I grew up, but it's an amazing place.
Excellent. The only place that I see listed that I am genuinely, I'm curious about all of them, but you sent me a list of the places that you've been. And Madagascar is on the list, and I'm interested to know what your experiences were like there.
I really didn't get out of the capital city, so I can only talk about Antananarivo. And I was there on a particular, well, at a time, and we were having some management difficulties, but I won't get into here. But my job was pretty much restricted to going to the mission and dealing with the work issues that I had going on at the time. I was able to get out into the suburbs of Antananarivo. I think I had dinner at some of the staff, but I did see some of the lemurs. It's a high altitude city. I did not get down to the coast. I didn't get far enough out of the city to see to see enough of the exotic wildlife they have there. I my only such experiences were, as I mentioned earlier, on the coast of both Tanzania and Kenya. And I have to assume that, it would have been similar, but the wildlife is unique in Madagascar, the lemurs and the other things that got there. I just didn't get out of town, so I can't. It's a very crowded city, very dirty, a lot of traffic, and I wouldn't recommend it as a tourist destination. Now, there may be some resorts on the coast, or at least the western coast of Madagascar. I've heard a lot about. I was working in an agency that people were posted down there. The thing I wish I had been able to do is to see Victoria Falls. I never came near it, and I'm told it's a mind bending experience to see it up close. And I never took the blue train. There's a train that runs from Pretoria to Cape Town, and I'm told that is a must do if you ever have a chance to take it. But I was not able to do that. What my most memorable experience in Southern Africa is when I took a bus from the airport in Windhoek, Namibia, which used to be German Southwest Africa. And if you had blindfolded me when I got on that bus and then taken the blindfold off when we got to Windhoek and told me I was in Phoenix, Arizona, I would have believed you.
Oh,
And then if you had given me a rental car and told me to drive around for 20 minutes, but don't go more than 3 or 4 miles in any direction, I still would have believed you. I would have thought the only thing that looked weird was that I would have seen a little more German than I would have expected in, say, Tucson or Phoenix. But other than that, it looked like driving around parts of the Southwest in the U.S. And then when I went downtown in Windhoek, here I am in Africa. I'm looking around. I don't see any blacks anywhere. I said, what continent am I on? I couldn't believe it. It was just a very civilized, very highly developed place. Finally, I started to learn what had happened. They had genocide down there. The Germans really just chased the tribes out of the capital city, and they're just slowly moving back now. But there was a terrible genocide before World War. I don't think it was before World War One. River populated the city.
wow, that's incredible. Well, let's do this, Cliff. We've probably got maybe one or two more stories or experiences in us before we get to our final five questions. I can't believe it's been over an hour already. So, is there anywhere else you can take us? Have you spent some time in Asia? I know you mentioned China already. Anywhere else? Anywhere in the world, doesn't matter where. Anything you can share with us.
Well, one of my favorite places, and I've been there many times because I first went there, it was Panama. And I first went there on a ship. And this was a time when the canal zone was still run by the Americans. And our ship stopped at the Rodman Naval Base. And that was in 1969. And then in late 1972, when I had that fellowship, I was back in Central America, and I had to take a bus down to the Canal College, which was a junior college in the Farm Canal Zone. That's where I took the law school admissions test. And then I was assigned as a regional legal advisor in 1992 to Honduras, and I had that job for 7 years. I was always traveling down to Panama on on what we call TDYs, and I was instrumental in negotiating some of the base closures down there when we had to close our military bases, the Rodman Naval Base and whatnot. So I had a lot of experiences in Panama. And I like to tell people it's like the Lebanon of Central America. It had people from, of course, because of the canal, there's so many different cultures that settled there. And when the canal zone was still American, it was like visiting Southern California. They were, the blonde-haired girls in open jeeps, the driving back and forth, and it was obviously hotter, and you could have tremendous rain. But the guy that I used to stay with, he had been my neighbor in Nairobi, and he was the chief administrative officer for USAID in Panama. So he would take me fishing on this lake. We got their lake got through, and most of the canal, it's not a canal. There's canals on both sides of a big lake, and it's Lake Gatun. And at some point, there was so much rain that some fish pond overflowed, and these bass got into that lake. So now it's the most amazing fishing. He would take me out there, and we just you wouldn't wait more than 30 seconds before you had a bite, and you're reeling in striped bass, almost as many as you can get, and at the same time you're trying to stay out of the way of the big ships that are traveling through this lake. And then the city itself has some very Latin areas, but it also has Lebanese areas, it has Chinese areas, it has upscale apartments with wealthy people from all over the world. And the roads are good, the bridges are good, the food is fantastic. I loved Panama, and I considered retiring down there. It's just an amazing place. I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, it's one place that we stayed on the very southeastern part of Costa Rica, and it was very close to Panama. And we talked about going, and we never did. And I guess it's one of those places I probably should visit one day.
The canal zone is worth seeing, but the rest of it is worth seeing. There's a lot of history. But there's another place that I think deserves at least an honorable mention is Nicaragua. Although I can't speak to what it's like nowadays with Daniel Ortega back in power, and he just recently announced that they will never have elections. Like, this guy is, at least he's being honest about it. He's going to stay in charge until he dies. But so it could be problematic to visit. But when I lived there, there were a lot of things about it that made it very different from the rest of Central America. For one thing, the Americans had been around there for many years. They even ran the place. The Marines ran it for about 20 years. The streets are wider than most of the Central American capital cities. And right after it was in the 1848, when the gold rush happened in California, so many Americans we didn't have a Panama Canal in those days. So they went down to a city on the Caribbean side, and they traveled up a river to Lake Managua, which is a very big lake in the middle of Nicaragua. And then there's a small strip of land on the western side. And if you cross over to that, they would come to a port called San Jose del Sur, I think is the name of it. And then they would catch boats up to San Francisco. But a lot of people, they were Americans that came through there, and they said, this is pretty good. This is pretty good land. It's a nice climate. And they settled there. So to this day, you can find a lot of blue-eyed, blonde-haired people down there in Nicaragua. And then their younger brothers, about 20 years later, fought in the Civil War. And those from the South that didn't want to live under the when the North was in charge of the South for a few years, they were very tough on former Southern veterans. So a lot of those former soldiers knew that their older brothers had gone through Nicaragua. Some of them had even settled there. So several thousand of them went back down to Nicaragua also. And you had these two waves of gringos that came in there and stayed there. At one point, there were two cities in Nicaragua, Granada and Leon, were fighting a civil war, and they recruited a guy from California named William Walker, and they even made him their president for a while. But then they later, when the other city won the Civil War, they shot him. But the gringos have had so much influence down in Nicaragua, and then the Marines came in the 20s, and ran it for a while. it has a different feel from all the other countries in Central America. And, that you can take advantage of the climate and the beaches on both sides. It's a phenomenal place. I met on the Caribbean side, they've got in Bluefields, they speak an old form of English that they call it the King's English. You can't understand it uh, when they're speaking to each other. If they slow down and deliberately try to make it intelligible to you, you can understand it. But it's not Spanish. It's not normal English. But it's a very different culture on the Caribbean side of Nicaragua. I spent a week on a shrimp boat floating around in the Pearl Keys and around Bluefields. There's just a lot of history in that area. Cornelius Vanderbilt ran a transportation company that was getting these gold miners from one side to the other that I met. That would come up that river I mentioned and then take them on boats across Lake Managua and on mules to get over to San Jose del Sur on the Pacific side.
So what's life like on a shrimp boat for a week? Just out of curiosity.
That was pretty crazy. The shrimper had converted his boat to sort of a bed and breakfast kind of thing for tourists. So it was myself and my I had two 20-year-old kids then, and another couple of other couples were on this ship, and we went out to the Pearl Keys. We'd spent New Year's Eve for the turn of the millennia from 1999 into 2000. We camped out on the Pearl Keys at an island that had no infrastructure whatsoever. It was just coconut trees and some rats and a beach. And we spent the night there, and a storm came up and created all kinds of havoc with us. It blew tents up into the trees and whatnot. And they were trying to keep the boat steady so that we'd have a boat to get on in the morning. And they broke their anchor chain. So then they couldn't stay anchored next to the shore. So they had to just putter back and forth all night long. And in the process, they used up so much fuel that we were worried that we wouldn't have enough to get where we were going or to get back to Bluefields the next day. So it was quite an adventure, but that's how we spent the turn of the millennium.
Oh, that's definitely something you'll never forget. I remember where I was, but it was nothing like that. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Is there anything else before? And I did want to ask too, actually. So does that mean that there is still an American contingency in Nicaragua then?
I don't think so. I know the USAID mission is closed, but that happened even before early 2025 when the whole agency disappeared. But I'm not sure that we even have an embassy down there for that matter. I know we don't think Ortega is legitimately in power, but that's a good question. I frankly haven't followed any of the news about our own relationship with Nicaragua. I had followed Daniel Ortega. I was there right after he lost an election to a woman in Violeta Chamorro I guess I got down there in 1999, and she had won an election a few years earlier. And when I was there, he was between his regimes, but somehow he got back into power, and he's made it a one-party state ever since.
Yeah, and I don't know about it either. I guess I would have been a little bit surprised if you had said yes, there still is for sure. But when you had mentioned so many Americans had moved there and kind of settled there, I wondered if there was still some of us there. Yes.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of Nicaraguans that for many years they lived in Miami when they were fighting against remember the Contra wars when we were
Yeah.
we were financing a struggle to overthrow the Contras who had come into power, but they basically overthrew themselves when they agreed to an election. And a woman who had lived in Miami, Violeta Chamorro, won. So a lot of these people that went back to claim their properties, they're half American because a lot of them lived here many years, and then they went back to Nicaragua. So there's a lot more English is spoken there than in other parts of Central America. And it just feels that baseball is a national sport, a big national sport there. And it has a feel that is very different from say Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, or even Costa Rica. I don't know Costa Rica that well. I traveled through it a few times by land, but I didn't stop and enjoy it as much as I could have.
Yeah. That's one of those places I really enjoy, and I would encourage anyone to go there and spend some time, but into Costa Rica. But just looking at the clock, I'm not in a rush, but we should probably head toward the final 5 questions. But if you have any other, we barely scratched the surface on many of the places that you've been. But is there anything else before we get to that you definitely want to share with the listeners?
I think it's worth getting out there and getting your toe in the water in terms of international travel. I think it's a life-changing experience to see what life is like in these other places. I can't tell you which place made the most difference to me. Well, in one sense I can, and it was certainly Kyrgyzstan because I married a woman there and we're raising 3 kids. So I guess Kyrgyzstan gets that prize. But for me, um, living abroad gave me a sense that the world is a much more connected place than we often think it is, and people are not that different, frankly. There are differences, but then deep down, we're all the same. And that's what I got out of my career.
Yeah, thank you for saying that before I did, because I've said it enough times on here, so it's great to hear someone else say it. I think those of us that have experience, and I clearly have not had the experiences that you have, and the amount of experience you have traveling, but it's the that's a real thing. It's a real thing. So,
For sure. For sure.
well, let's do the final 5. I don't think you know these, right?
No, I don't.
Excellent, excellent. So, and I love the off the top of the head answers, so it's great, and it's all easy. So don't be nervous. But in answering these questions, if you do if you do want to expand on any of these stories with your answers, that would be fantastic. So, question number 1, and I phrase this very carefully. I say it every time, but you're new. So, of all the places in the world that you have ever been, what would you say are 1 or 2 of your favorite meal experiences you've ever had?
Oh, that's easy. Feijoada. It's a Brazilian dish made from lima beans and ham. And the first time I tasted it was in a restaurant in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. But I'll order that anytime I see it on any menu, almost anywhere. Feijoada is what it's called. The other one that I think has got a very high place in my list of favorite things to eat is just Central American plof. The PLOF is what it sounds like. They spell it PLOV, but it's rice and it's lamb and it's carrots and it's onions and maybe raisins, and it's just a very delicious staple Central American dish. And but you got to get it with grass-fed lamb or sheep that were raised in the pastures of Central Asia to really appreciate it. And I'll stop there. There's a lot more I could name, but
And I think it's wonderful. Those, again, brand new answers on the podcast, so that's excellent. Is there any? I'm going to piggyback off this and say, is there any meal experience that you've had anywhere in the world that it maybe wasn't the food, but the experience itself you just will never forget?
yes, there's a dish, a Kyrgyz dish called besh parmak, and what that means in Kyrgyz is 5 fingers. And what it is, you have to sit on the floor in a Kyrgyz yurt, and this is especially memorable when you're being interviewed by your future wife's male relatives to see if you pass muster. But if you sit on the floor of a Kyrgyz yurt and they serve a big bowl of noodles to everybody, and you dive in with your hands, that's why they call it 5 fingers. Everyone is reaching in with their hands in the same pot and grabbing these noodles and bringing them back and trying to get them in their mouth while simultaneously sitting on the floor, which I'm not good at. That was a very memorable experience that I don't care to repeat.
I can't imagine. No, thank you. But obviously, you passed the test, so that was good.
I did.
So, okay, moving on. Question number 2. I always say this is one of my favorite questions because of the variety of answers. And I have had guests who don't have an answer, and that's fine. Of all the places in the world, I imagine you will. Of all the places in the world that you have been, Even if I said to you, Cliff, here's a free trip, go enjoy yourself, you would say, no, thank you, I don't want to go back.
Guinea Conakry. I would avoid it. It's one of the dirtiest and unpleasant places I've ever lived.
What was it again?
Guinea, the capital city of Guinea in West Africa. It was the only former French colony that decided not to join the West African Union. So the French, as only the French could do, decided, well, to hell with you then, we're going to take everything. And they took the light bulbs, they took the railroad tracks out, they took absolutely everything out. And that place is a basket case. It would not be worthy of existing as a nation, except for the fact that the Soviet Union came in there later and discovered bauxite, and it has about a third of the world's bauxite. So there's some huge mines there that ship bauxite to Iceland and other places where it's refined into aluminum. But in the meantime, it's just a really, really poor part of the world, and there's just no redeeming value from a touristic standpoint whatsoever. I would say no, thank you. I would go to Freetown. I would go to Dakar. I would even perhaps consider Monrovia, but I would stay away from Conakry.
Okay, another new answer. I love this. This is great. And a very fair reason why. Okay, so question number 3, we flip that around 180 degrees and we say, of all the places in the world that you have been, but I add a caveat here. If for some reason you only had 1 or 2 trips left in your lifetime, what would be those 1 or 2 places that you absolutely have to go back to?
Wow, that's a tough one. I would go back to Mombasa on the Indian Ocean and see how it has changed and see if I could still remember my Swahili. Because there I don't use it at all, and that's probably long gone, but it was a phenomenal city when I was visiting, and I haven't come close to it ever since. So I would like to go back there and see what's different. It's beautiful. It's on the Indian Ocean. It's tropical. It's got great beaches. I'd like to see it again.
Excellent. Excellent. Again, another new answer. Okay. Question number 4 could be tough. It is, of all the places in the world that you have never been to, again, if you only had 1 or 2 trips left in your lifetime for whatever reason, what would be those 1 or 2 places you've never been that you absolutely want to get to?
I want to see Alaska. I heard so much about it when I was growing up. Some of the kids in my high school and college worked in fisheries up there. I have cousins up in Juneau and Kodiak Island. I've heard about it all my life, but when the ship I worked on was part of the Coast and Geodetic Survey, and the rest of the fleet, the one I was on headed south, but the rest of the fleet was busy going back and forth up through the Inland Passage. They were also transporting pipe for the Alaska pipeline at the time, and I have never seen Alaska, and I think that's a prime. I need to get that solved at some point.
Yeah, that's one of the places on my list as well. So, and the final question that I have for you, Cliff, is you mentioned one. I know you're going to Washington here soon, but where are you going? What's already planned? Maybe the rest of this year into next year.
I'm going to Switzerland in September to see my oldest daughter and her 2 boys, and then when it's over, I'm going to go down to Nice and visit a buddy of mine who moved with his Russian-speaking wife to Nice, and I've never been to that part of Europe. And after that, I'm going to Newcastle in northern England to visit another friend up there. And I will finish the trip in Frankfurt because my book is going to be at the Frankfurt Book Fair from October 4th through the 11th. And I'm going to be there promoting my book and see what happens.
That's so excellent. This has been a lot of fun, Cliff. I've really enjoyed this time, and thank you for taking this much time with all of us. And you kind of did already kind of give a little bit of words of wisdom, but is there anything else you'd like to say before we stop on the episode?
Well, I first of all, thank you for the opportunity to ramble on for as long as I have. And if people are curious about our foreign aid agency and what it was like to actually live in it and work overseas, and I can recommend my book. But if they just want to learn about what happened when they destroyed it, there's a better book called Into the Wood Chipper, and that's because Elon Musk stood up one weekend and said he spent the weekend, or one Monday morning, he said, I spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper. And that tale needs to be told and appreciated, what happened. We are now north of 800,000 people have died whose deaths could have been prevented if our agency had not been destroyed. That's not a happy note to leave you with, but that's one of the things that's inspiring me to at least talk about USAID and get the word out there.
Absolutely incredible. And thank you for not correcting me, although you probably should have at the beginning when I called it USAID instead of USAID. But I appreciate you.
They're both ways. We go both ways. USAID or USAID or just AID. Some people still just call it AID.
Okay. Well, then I don't feel so bad then.
Not a problem.
Awesome.
Not a problem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cliff. I recommend everyone check out the books and, follow him on the socials. And again, everything will be in the show notes in the description. So thank you again, and have wonderful, wonderful travels, and good luck with the book fair.
Thank you so much. Take care, Del.
And there's another episode of the Where Have You Been podcast in the books. Thank you so much for listening today. There was another great guest with some great stories, as always, and I hope that you will support all of the guests by checking out the show notes and going to their web pages, seeing any socials and projects that they may have going on. And please, again, I'll ask as always to like, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really does help to allow the podcast to grow and reach more people, and I appreciate you for doing that. Also, if you haven't done so, check out the website, whybpodcast.com, where you can find blog posts. If you'd like to be a guest, please register to be a guest on the site, and check out the merch page. There's some really cool stuff if you're interested in representing the pod, along with some other cool travel items and apparel that I'm working on every day as well. Join me again next week for another great guest with more incredible stories. New episodes drop every Sunday just after midnight Eastern Time. Until then, thank you for being here, and have a great day.